It is day 178 of the second Trump administration, and Donald J. Trump just cannot figure out how to deal with the Epstein backlash. Here's a suggestion: stop talking about it. Well, he's not. Today, he tried something we very rarely see. He directly attacked his own base, calling them weaklings for falling for what he now calls a hoax. I can't explain it well enough. I'm going to have my colleague Garrett Haake give you all the details.
Tonight, President Trump lashing out at his own supporters amid the ongoing Republican outcry over his administration's decision not to release Justice Department files related to convicted sex offender Jeffrey Epstein.
I lost a lot of faith in certain people, I lost, because they got duped by the Democrats.
The president dismissing the interest by some in the MAGA world in Epstein as a Democratic distraction and chastising those supporters as, quote, weaklings.
It's all been a big hoax. It's perpetrated by the Democrats, and some stupid Republicans and foolish Republicans fall into the net, and so they try and do the Democrats' work. They're wasting their time with a guy who obviously had some very serious problems, who died 3-4 years ago. I'd rather talk about the success we have with the economy, the best we've ever had, and all of the things we've done, including the Middle East.
Want to talk economy? Sure, let's talk inflation, but that is not the president's only grievance. Today, he continued his attacks on Fed Chair Jay Powell. Watch this.
I think he does a terrible job. He's costing us a lot of money, and we fight through it. He's a terrible Fed Chair. I was surprised he was appointed.
He was surprised? He was surprised. So what we did was we dug deep into our archive to find out just how this man, Jay Powell, was ever appointed and who exactly was responsible. Here's what we found out.
It is my pleasure and my honor to announce my nomination of Jerome Powell to be the next chairman of the Federal Reserve. Congratulations, Jay.
All right, then. That is settled. But I want to level set on something else, because Donald Trump is proving yet again today that he does not have the final say. You know who does? The market. We all just witnessed Trump basically test how markets would react to his threat to fire Fed Chair Powell. This morning, the New York Times reported that Trump has written a draft of a letter to fire Powell, and he showed it to a group of congressional Republicans last night. And what happened almost instantly? Markets dropped sharply. Here's how the S&P 500 did today. Thanks to our friend Justin Wolfers for this chart. That red arrow you see going sharply down is what happened immediately after that report came out. Then a short time later, after markets dropped, the president was asked about that very report, about that letter, about him looking to fire Powell. And here's what he said.
I talked about the concept of fire him. I said, what do you think? I don't rule out anything, but I think it's highly unlikely, unless he has to leave for fraud.
Highly unlikely. Well, guess what happened? The market immediately rebounded. Right there on your screen, the green arrow you see right there, that is what happened. And that right there is why Wall Street has come to view Donald Trump in this way. They now believe that it is always Taco Tuesday in Trump Town. Trump always chickens out. But here's my question. Could Wall Street be wrong? Could Donald Trump not go taco and instead fire Powell or go through with crippling tariffs? Maybe. But remember this, investors can pivot as fast as Trump does. Betting on the market is way different from running a real business. You can buy it all at 2 p.m. and sell it all at 2:05. The markets move based on probability. And historically speaking, he's a taco guy. If that changes, they will turn in a flash. For real businesses that require long-term planning, long-term investing, that roller coaster is leaving them hanging on for dear life. But one thing thus far does seem clear. The markets are betting big on taco, that Trump will continue to chicken out. And so far, the president is delivering. With that, let's bring in our nightcap. Philip Bumpus here, Washington Post columnist, focused largely on the numbers behind politics. Nayyera Huq joins us, former White House senior director and former State Department senior advisor. She is now the assistant dean for the Syracuse Maxwell School in D.C. And former Democratic New York Congressman Max Rose joins us. He's now a senior advisor to Vote Vets. Mr. Bump, it seems like the president has now completely backed off of this idea of firing Jay Powell, even though we've been talking about it for days. And we've been talking about it for days because this president has been suggesting it.
Yeah, I don't think I'd say he's completely backed off, because I think the key thing that he said there was, I'm not planning on firing him unless there's fraud. And what we've seen is he's trying to contrive this charge that Powell did some redecoration that went outside of his mandate and was fraudulent in some way. He's actually dispatched people to try and make that case. He's basically trying to do to Jerome Powell what he did to Kilmer Garcia, which is come up with charges after the fact to justify the action that he's taken or wants to take. And so I think what he's saying there is, oh, I'm not going to fire him, but if we find that he did fraud, something's going to have to happen. Now, look, I think at the end of the day, Trump's kind of happy to have Powell there because it means that he has someone to blame if things do go south in the markets, right? He can say, oh, well, he should have cut interest rates. But at the same time, that door that he left open there, I think is important to remember.
It would be unprecedented if Trump tried to remove the Fed chair. But can you lay out for people who are watching, everyday Americans don't think about the Fed chair, but if the Fed chair, the Fed being independent, right, unlike what we see in other countries, why it's important and what would change if that wasn't the case?
Well, first of all, the markets would flip out. And,
for sure,
you know, who cares? Because, you know, half the country isn't exposed to the market and so on and so forth. But it really doesn't end there. What immediately happens that's perhaps most cataclysmic is interest rates for average consumers. They want to get a car, buy a home.
Borrow money for anything.
Borrow money for anything becomes absolutely calamitous. What's so ironic, though, about this situation is Trump wants the Fed to lower rates. At the same time, it's his tariffs that are causing inflation to go up. That is the principal reason why the Fed cannot lower rates. So, as usual, Donald Trump is the epitome of irrational, contradictory mania.
It's not about economic sense. It's not about hard economic policy. It's really about Trump wanting things to be a certain way and creating stories after the fact or creating facts later to match that story. And he wants a command and control economy. That's the reality.
But you cannot have that.
Because in theory, this is the United States and we are a liberal capitalist society. However, slowly but surely, this is the same way Trump has been moving with the law. And he's trying to move that with the economy, of bringing it all under the Trump umbrella, and what he says goes.
You've worked at the State Department and the Treasury. How would the world react, right? Wow. If the United States, if you saw a president remove our Fed chair?
I wish I could say they would be shocked at this point, but this is the second Trump administration, and we are living in unprecedented times where things are now precedented with Trump. We have seen versions of these actions before where people who are considered independent of the U.S. government have been subject to Trump's whims or his prosecutions, right? They've been removed from office. They've been targeted after the fact with criminal investigations. And sadly, that is actually what happens in much of the developing world. So Trump is matching what happens in kingdoms and autocracies and in developing countries, not what happens in the top 10 OECD countries where most people would like to keep their investments.
Max, you said something that is sticking with me, that what would happen if you removed the Fed chair? The markets would flip out. What was amazing today is the markets sharply declined, right? There was a significant dip. You saw them turn red when it was believed Trump could do this. But they didn't drop as much as you might think they would, because investors actually see this as more political theater.
Sure.
They don't believe what they're hearing out of the White House. And normally, you hear anything from the White House, from the Fed, markets move in huge ways, just a hint, a shade of an opinion. Is Donald Trump losing control of the news cycle, especially with the professional investor community, because maybe they say he's the boy that cried wolf?
I actually think it's exactly the opposite. I think the financial class is underestimating Donald Trump. And look, as demonstrated by recent New York City politics, clearly the financial class doesn't understand politics. Otherwise,
this is an amazing point.
They would run much better super PACs than they do. But the more that they underestimate the impact that Donald Trump can have on the economy. Look at the tariffs, right? The first time that the tariffs get announced, there's a larger dip in the market than we saw at the height of COVID. Second time he announces it, it's this little blip. But guess what? The tariffs are still there. And it's a $40 billion monthly tax on average American consumers. It's still there. And the market's like, oh, okay, whatever. So they can sit on the sidelines while Donald Trump does this. But we still see now inflation rising. when affordability is the biggest issue in the United States of America. So they'll stay on the sidelines till they stop staying on the sidelines. The markets are going to be a lagging indicator here, not a leading indicator of sentiment and economic reality.